Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 84 for Sunday, 7th of March 2021, and this week we're covering the 2019 movie, Just Mercy, starring Michael B. Jordan as lawyer Bryan Stevenson and Jamie Foxx as his client, convicted murderer Walter McMillian, also known as Johnny D. My name is Andrew Blischek, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Andrew, and hello, everybody. Long time since we last put a show out together. So in line with the new format, we are going to address reviews, listener feedback and other news at the end of the show. We will have a promo for another history podcast, The History of North America from Mark Vinet. And we've got emails from Nick Parkinson, Kelly Jenkins, Robin Manet and Brad Michael. We've also got some donation acknowledgements and a few reviews. So without further preamble, you expected us to say adieu there, didn't you? Eh? Here is the story of the movie.
Someday for a crown.
Just Mercy, the story of the movie. Just Mercy is a 2019 movie based around the events described in the book of the same name, authored by civil rights lawyer Bryan Stevenson. Michael B. Jordan stars as Bryan Stevenson, a young Harvard-educated defence lawyer who takes up the case of death row inmate Walter McMillian, played by Jamie Foxx. The movie is directed by Destin Daniel Cretton, a youngish Hawaiian director, and was positively reviewed by critics.
Yeah, it was made for a very modest $25 million, and the movie made over $50 million worldwide at the box office, although in the present day, especially since the closure of most cinemas due to the pandemic, box office receipts are becoming less and less accurate in determining whether a movie was a financial success or not. I mean, look at the ones that stream straight away onto Netflix. The only people who probably know are the production company who made it and distributed it. I mean, doubling your money looks good, but bearing in mind Professor Mark Dupre's warning about remembering distribution and advertising costs, it's hard to say. All we can really definitively say is it definitely wasn't a disaster, but neither was it a huge financial success.
Rotten Tomatoes rates it at 84% positive from critics, which is pretty strong, and that's out of 291 critic reviews. And it gets a whacking 99% positive from the audiences, and the audience sample stands at almost 12,000. It didn't receive any major awards, although the Screen Actors Guild Awards, the SAG Awards, did nominate Jamie Foxx for Best Supporting Actor. The Academy Awards included not a single mention of Just Mercy, an omission that brought widespread comment at the time. That said, there is near universal praise for the performances of both Foxx and of Jordan. So with that, shall we get on with the synopsis and the analysis, Martin?
Absolutely.
Okay, we have the opening scene with a text that tells us that this is based on a true story. As the movie opens, we're told we're in Monroe County, Alabama, 1987. We see a logging crew hard at work, and we meet Johnny D. His real name is Walter McMillian, played by Jamie Foxx. He's in a truck driving home that evening when he's pulled over by a sheriff's roadblock. The sheriff talks to him and clearly reveals that he knows who Johnny D is, and he becomes a bit hostile towards him. We've got a clip of that now.
It's a sharp-looking truck you got.
Thank you.
His rims look like they cost you a pretty penny. Who you been working for?
Oh, no, sir. I don't work for nobody. I got my own pumping business. You know, I clear out all these trees around here.
So you ain't got no boss to check in with, huh? That must be pretty nice. Free to run up and down the road wherever you want to, whenever you want to in this fancy truck.
Yeah, well, not if my wife got something to say about it.
Yeah. I heard that ain't stopped you before, though. Ain't that right, Johnny D? You won't make a break for it?
No, sir, I don't want to do nothing.
Because after what you've done, I'm looking for any excuse to get this over with right here, right now.
So I ain't did nothing, and I think y'all got the wrong person here. Y'all got me confused with somebody, and I think...
I ain't got you confused with nobody.
I don't have anything to do with this.
We then jump to a news report revealing that Rhonda Morrison, an 18-year-old white girl, has been murdered by Johnny D, who was convicted by a jury and sentenced to life imprisonment, only for a judge, Robert E. Lee Key, to overturn the life imprisonment sentence and instead condemns McMillian to death. We then see an interview with the Sheriff Tom Tate, who's adamant that justice has been done. So how do they go in the opening of setting the scene for this one, Mark?
Yeah, to set the scene, I mean, for example, an article in The Atlantic from 1999 says, today Judge Key says he doesn't want to talk about the McMillian case and volunteers that McMillian had one of the finest criminal attorneys in the state of Alabama representing him, a black attorney, by the way. I'll go to my grave believing he was guilty as hell. I mean, that's the attitude. McMillian, his name's spelt McMillian, but it's always pronounced McMillian, and usually referred to in the movie as Johnny D. So I think we'll try and stick with, I think we generally stick with Johnny D. Now, he had his trial moved by Judge Key from a county with a 40% black population to one with a 13% black population. His trial lasted a day and a half before the 90% white jury, 11 out of 12 of the jurors were white, found him guilty and recommended a sentence of life imprisonment. Bear in mind, there was no physical evidence. Judge Key then overturned this sentence and imposed the death penalty, something called the judge override, which is unique to Alabama. I'm sorry about the noises in the background. I've got our Colin, our slightly disabled cat's got a plastic collar around his neck because he's got an injury to his ear. And he's making some noises, which hopefully aren't too distracting. Now, Sheriff Tate was newly elected and he was under pressure to find the killer of Rhonda Morrison. It was 6 months after the murder that he arrested Johnny D. And something that I think is worthy of comment is the politicisation of key law enforcement and judicial posts like judges and sheriffs is something that, for me as someone from Britain, is really alien. Our police and judicial positions are appointed by apolitical professional bodies, and whilst they're far from universally competent, at least they're free to make decisions based on factors other than the need for popularity and re-election. An American elected official can find themselves in a dilemma between doing what they think is right versus what a majority of electors in his or her area would like, thereby ensuring re-election and leading to a very obvious conflict of interest. I mean, if you're in a minority in any given area, by definition, you're not going to be represented by someone you chose if there's a conflict between the majority population and the minority. I mean, in a young emerging country with still developing professional standards and codes, such as the US in its early years, elections were understandable, but surely by now they should have done away with this system of judges and sheriffs being elected. It's like, wow, talk about trying to maintain the status quo and not allow any kind of progression.
And in some instances, you know, prosecutors like district attorneys have to stand for elections, which means they have to schmooze up to people and ask them for donations, and you know, it must skew the whole system away from impartiality. Not that I'm an expert in legal systems across the world, but I'm with you, coming from Australia, where the judiciary is very independent and proudly so. It is a very, very strange arrangement, but it is what it is, I guess.
No, I mean, we have an Attorney General who's the senior law officer who will be a lawyer who is also an MP, and they're appointed, and that's a political appointee. But that's it. All the judges, they're not chosen by the Prime Minister. It's just, no, or by local election. I don't know, it's like, just seems, yeah. And I suppose when you've got a fledgling country and you've got an isolated community where generally people will, birds of a feather flock together, so you will find, people of a similar outlook will found a town in Utah or Pennsylvania or Oregon, wherever it may be. Then electing one of your own means that, the sheriff or the judge reflect the local population. But you've now got areas with massively diverse populations who've come from all over the world at all sorts of different times. So anyway, and it is worth pointing out that Robert E. Lee Key, I mean, you can guess where his parents' political affiliations lay. And if you're a person of colour and you're up for a crime, particularly a crime against a white person, and you're told the judge is Robert E. Lee Key, you can probably guess, which way this is going to go. Anyway, so that's the scene setting, and now we're going to meet the main protagonist of the movie, Bryan Stevenson. So back with the movie.
Yeah, in the next scene, as you say, we meet Bryan Stevenson for the first time, played by up-and-coming actor Michael B. Jordan. Stevenson is a young African-American law intern whom we find in Jackson, Georgia, meeting a client in prison. The client is told that Bryan isn't yet a lawyer, but has been told to tell the prisoner, one Henry Davies, that he's not at risk of execution for at least a year, and efforts are being made to find him a proper lawyer. The two men, Davies and Stevenson, sit and chat about their backgrounds, and they find that they've got much in common. We find out that Bryan is currently at Harvard studying law so he can help people, and a white guard abruptly comes in and roughly drags Henry away, and he snarls that they've run overtime. Okay, so that's the first. How's that background on Stevenson, the young law student?
Yeah, no, it's very accurate. He was from an educated but far from wealthy family in Delaware, of course, where Joe Biden hails from, or represented as a senator, I think. Bryan Stevenson's father was a laboratory technician, and his mother worked as an equal opportunities officer at an Air Force base, which is interesting, So he's got a moral background, but he didn't come from money. He got a scholarship to Harvard, where by all accounts he absolutely blitzed the law degree. He was very close to, if not at the top of his class in pretty much all the way through. So this is a very, very talented young man who, from conviction, from his belief system, decided rather than going to work for some big law firm and make his millions, he wanted to try and put things right where he didn't feel they were being kept on an even keel. And you see a scene where he says goodbye to his parents. That's coming up, where his mother's obviously concerned.
Okay, so as you say, let's get back to the movie. And suddenly it's 2 years later. We're in Delaware, and Bryan is packing his car with his books and his clothes. He's saying goodbye to his parents, and his mother, as Martin's mentioned, is worried as he's heading down south, not a good place for a young black man. She warns him that if he does what he hopes to do, he's going to upset a lot of people. And Bryan appears aware of the risks, but he's determined to try and do stuff for the good down in the south. Then he arrives in Alabama. He enters a building to meet a colleague, one Eva Ansley, played by Brie Larson, who's being told that the office space that they'd agreed to rent is suddenly no longer available, now that the owner that was going to rent it to them knows their purpose, helping murderers on death row, as the man puts it. Eva and her husband have Bryan over for dinner that evening, and we learn that she and Bryan have teamed up to try and help people on death row who have been possibly wrongly convicted. So is any of that accurate? The personalities involved and the motivations and where he ended up in Alabama?
Yeah, very much. I mean, he had ambitions to try and bring a degree of real justice to the South, and he felt there was nowhere better to set up than Alabama, partly because of the statistics, which we'll get to later in the show. But also, it's quite symbolic, I think, for the civil rights movements, as we saw with Selma, which is, of course, a town in Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama. So many of the 1960s civil rights main events happened there. Eva Ainsley is pretty accurately portrayed too. The scene where she's denied previously promised office space, it did happen, but just not quite at this time in this place. So that they've dropped a mildly fictional scene in, or that it's a true scene. They just put it in a slightly different context.
Other than that slight glitch, they've done pretty well setting up accurately the historical events up until about now, haven't they?
Very much so, yeah.
Okay, so back in the movie, Bryan arrives at an Alabama prison to visit 6 clients that are prisoners there, but the guard denies that he's been listed on the visitor's log, which is what Bryan expected. Bryan's then told that he'll have to be strip searched. Despite Bryan's protest that attorneys aren't searched, the guard tells him he's not visiting shit if he doesn't agree. He reluctantly goes ahead and strips down, only to be told by the smirking guard, "It's okay, you can get dressed again." So he's just showing him who's boss. His first client is a black Vietnam veteran called Herbert Richardson, who admits that he did in fact plant a bomb as he's charged with, but he's adamant that he didn't mean for it to go off and kill anyone. His speech is hesitant, but Bryan assures him that Bryan will fight for his life even though he's on death row. Bryan then sees a succession of inmates, most black men, only one of them white, all of whom tell similar stories about a lack of effective legal representation at their trials. Then Bryan meets Walter McMillian, who is sceptical about their chances of achieving anything that hasn't already been tried in the Alabama courts. Bryan reels off a host of options, but McMillian tells him that all his fancy words won't make any difference in Alabama. McMillian tells Bryan that no one has been freed from Alabama death row, and he doesn't think Bryan will be able to change that. Okay, so now we've got Walter McMillian, also known as Johnny D. Do you want to just comment on the accuracy of those couple of scenes?
Yeah, I mean, the movie will focus on the fight to free Johnny D, Walter McMillian, but Bryan found there were many other prisoners in a similar situation, and he took on as many as he felt he could manage. Now, Herbert Richardson's crime is obliquely mentioned through the movie, but not in any great detail. There'll be reference to a bomb, and without giving away spoilers, because assuming that most people will have seen the movie by the time they listen, or maybe not, but Herbert had served in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division, and he had seen intense action. In one fight, he was the only survivor of his platoon or his squad, depending on your source. I think squad's probably more likely. It's like a section of 8 to 10 men. A platoon, I mean, you're talking probably 25 to 35 guys, depending on their configuration. That would have been quite a thing for that many guys to have been killed. But he was the only survivor of one instance. He'd been knocked unconscious during the attack. He later suffered headaches so severe that he'd attempted suicide on a number of occasions. Back in the States, he was being treated for his wounds and his emotional state, and he fell for one of the nurses treating him. They did briefly date, but she ended the relationship, and he devised a plan to win her back by planting a bomb on her doorstep. He was going to detonate it, then rush in to heroically save her, having convinced himself that this would win her heart. Tragically, her niece found the bomb first, picked it up, and it detonated, killing the young girl. So this is the crime for which Herbert was convicted and sentenced to execution. I mean, to me, at worst, that's aggravated manslaughter. It's probably not even aggravated. It's a really, really stupidly, dangerously stupid thing to do. But I don't know what the Americans would call it, 3rd-degree murder? I mean, he clearly did not intend to kill that young girl.
And as I was watching this movie, and they're setting it up with these incarcerated black guys who've got limited education and opportunities and have been treated very badly by the justice system, I just got the feeling that this was a neat little amalgamation of people that didn't really individually exist, but was, representative of these sorts of people. And I mentioned that to my wife at the time. But, I think I was proved wrong in every circumstance. The people portrayed, as you've just dictated, as you just told us, were real people, even though they didn't tell us all the details of them. They got the details pretty right, and I was impressed by the end of the movie when I did my research as to how accurate they were for all these individual instances, even if they, as you say, they do gloss over what he'd done.
And for anyone who hasn't seen the movie, or for those who have, watch all the way through the end titles, because what you'll get is a few of the credits role, and then there'll be another clip with a bit more information about someone who's in the movie, or about Bryan Stevenson or the Equal Justice Initiative and what they do. And there's some really good information at the end, which if you turn off when it just comes up and says the end, you'll miss. Yeah, okay.
Let's get back to the movie then. We see the people that Bryan have just visited. They all go back to their cells. Johnny D, he speaks with Herbert, one of the other inmates, and Herbert was quite impressed with Bryan, but Johnny D says he's just a kid who's making promises he can't keep. The banter flies between the black inmates, and Ray Hinton joins in. He's another inmate we haven't seen before. Back at his house, Bryan's becoming convinced that Walter McMillian, Johnny D, is innocent. He's looking through the evidence and realises that it all hinges on a single witness whose story doesn't seem to add up. Bryan says there are two other witnesses who claim to have seen Johnny D's low-rider truck near the scene. Eva sums up that this crime was unsolved for half a year. Then a man charged with a capital offence is offered a lesser sentence if he can bear witness against Johnny D. Bryan decides to meet with the district attorney and is encouraged to learn that the district attorney used to be a public defender, one of the good guys. Do you want to comment on that bit at all?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, we can understand Johnny D's reluctance to put much faith in Bryan and his plan. To Johnny, however much Bryan may not have come from a wealthy background, and he's also a man of colour, to him, this is just an educated northerner who doesn't yet understand how the judicial system works in the South. And as we learn more about his case, it's hard not to see his point.
Indeed. Okay, so now in the movie, we meet the district attorney, Tom Chapman, a cheerful and friendly fella who greets Bryan enthusiastically before quizzing Bryan about his intentions here in Alabama. And we've got the clip of the two meeting for the first time.
What can I do for you today, Bryan?
I wanted to speak to you about Johnny D. McMillian.
You know I wasn't part of his prosecution, right? That was way before my time.
And that's exactly why I wanted to meet you. You see, I've read through the record quite a few times now, and I have some serious doubts about the reliability of his conviction. If you could take a look at the sections I've highlighted here, you'll see some problems with Ralph Meyer's testimony.
Man, this is one of the most outrageous crimes in Monroe County history. Your client made a lot of people very angry.
I understand that, but there are some serious problems with this case. And I was hoping that I can get your support to figure out what really happened.
I already know what happened. Johnny D. McMillian was convicted by a jury of brutally murdering a teenage girl in my community, and it is my job to defend the integrity of that conviction.
Even if that conviction is based on false testimony.
You're the only one I know who thinks that.
Then I must be the only one who read that record because it's pretty obvious.
That man caused a lot of pain. A lot of pain for folks around here. And if you go digging in those wounds, you're gonna be making a lot of people very unhappy.
Well, it isn't my job to make people happy. It's to achieve justice for my client.
The witness in question, who was key to the conviction of Johnny D, turns out to be one Ralph Myers, and the district attorney hands over a very thin folder on Ralph. And he says this contains the witness statements relevant to the case. Bryan calls Eva to bring her up to speed before heading out to view the place where the crime, the murder of the 18-year-old girl, happened. He drives out to Walter McMillian's property where his wife, Minnie, and the extended family are waiting for him. There's a crowd in the McMillian kitchen who listen to Bryan speak. He learns that on the day of the murder, Johnny D and his son were at their house working on their truck, and there was a fish fry get-together later at their house, which was witnessed by dozens of his friends and family. We also learn that Johnny D had been caught playing away with a white woman, and that had infuriated some of the white community. Minnie, Johnny's wife, is still angry about him having an affair with a white woman, but she stands by her husband, and she's adamant that Johnny's being framed. Johnny D's son then angrily tells Bryan that he's not saying anything that other lawyers haven't said before, and they simply hollow words and they take their money. How is Bryan any different? And now we've got a clip of Bryan trying to win the family over.
A few months before the murder, Johnny D got caught messing around with a white woman in town.
When her husband found out about it, he made sure everybody knew. People started talking, and the stories kept growing. He went from being a cheat to a drug dealer to head of the Dixie Mafia. So by the time somebody called him a murderer, ain't nobody thought twice about it.
Now, they can call it what they want. This is just another way to lynch a black man.
That's right. There ain't no excuse for what my husband did to me and his family. Damn fool hurt me bad. But he's still the daddy of my kids. And I really don't know what I'm supposed to tell them about staying out of trouble when you can be in your own house, minding your own business, surrounded by your entire family, and they still go and put some murder on you.
I can only imagine the pain that you're going through. But I'm gonna do everything I can.
The last lawyers was talking just as big as you.
John.
Then they took all our money and split. Why you different?
Well, our organization will cover all legal fees, so none of you will ever have to pay a penny. Now, it's clear to me that this trial was constructed with lies. And based off everything that I've seen, I think we could build a case strong enough to bring Johnny D home. And I'm not gonna stop until I've done that.
Okay, so after this, Johnny D's son introduces Bryan to a friend of his, one Darnell Houston, who claims to be able to prove Johnny's innocence. Darnell tells Bryan that he was with the supporting witness, who the sheriff had found claimed he saw Johnny D's truck at the murder site, and then went nowhere near the site. So, in other words, Darnell can prove that the testimony by Ralph Meyer is false. So that's pretty good news. How's that as far as accuracy to the truth goes, Martin?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the DA, Tom Chapman is an interesting character. I've read several articles written in the aftermath of the movie's release saying that actually the movie plays down the growing animosity between the two guys, he and Bryan Stevenson, and it does get quite heated between them as the movie progresses, but in reality apparently it was even more so. I mean, despite having become DA after the original conviction of Johnny D, Chapman gave every indication that he firmly believed in Johnny D's guilt. How much of that is to placate the electorate, and we're back with the elected officials quandary, and how much was his actual belief is hard to tell. The fish fry at Johnny D's property, at which dozens of people, including an active police officer, were present, and they were all able to say that Johnny D was there, that really happened, and those witnesses really came forward. How many of them were heard at the original trial is hard to establish, but their evidence was either ignored or suppressed. Now, Johnny D did have an affair with a white woman, something that had infuriated many of the white population, let alone Johnny D's wife. And it's worth mentioning Karen Kendrick. She doesn't have a huge part to play, but she's very... It's a very well portrayed display of that kind of, yeah, I'm angry with him. No, I'm not happy, but there's a bigger issue at stake here. And also John McMillian, his son, played by C.J. LeBlanc, does a very good job. And I love that thing where he says, how are you any different? And Bryan says sort of, well, we're not going to charge you any money. This won't cost you anything. And that's just such a huge, okay, well, what's your motives? Wow, this guy might actually be doing something because he thinks it's right to do, not, for profit or to be elected or anything. So yeah, it's I think that's a really pivotal moment where you realise this is all going to be pro bono.
Yeah, the crowd. He does win them over. There is this little buzz across the crowd that, assembled in Johnny D's house that this might be something we could get excited about. Yeah, it was well done. You're right. Okay, Bryan visits Johnny D again in prison and tries to persuade him to accept his help and go fight for another legal trial. Johnny has already heard about Bryan's visit to his home and now is more inclined to listen than he was on Bryan's last visit. Bryan tells him about young Darnell Houston's revelation, and he tells him that he's going to now move for a new trial for Johnny. The two chat for a while, and eventually Johnny agrees that they should have another go. Later, we see Johnny chatting to his neighbouring cellmates, and they learn that Herbert has had his extension date set, one of the members of his social group there, I guess you'd call them, in prison. At their office, we see Eva summing up Herbert's war record. He was diagnosed with severe PTSD, having been the only survivor of an ambush of his unit. They know that he did plant that bomb and that did kill the girl, but they're still looking for grounds to reduce the death penalty to life imprisonment. Eva then takes a phone call that tells her a bomb is going to kill her and her family if she doesn't work for that bleeping lawyer and that bleeping Johnny D. It's a hoax, we learn, but still, of course, it's shaking them all up. They do decide that they'll take Johnny D's case and start investigating the issues from scratch. They start asking around town, but virtually no one will talk to them, at least among the white community. Then Bryan meets a cop who was the first on the scene, and the cop agrees to talk, although we don't hear their conversation. We see a lady in a cafe remembering a poster that Johnny's family had put up about their fish fry to raise money for the local church, and she still has a homemade poster for it. Bryan is now in a proper office, and his organisation has now become the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI. He receives a call and goes to get Darnell Houston from jail, where the cops have arrested him for perjury simply because he signed an affidavit saying that he'd been with the supposed witness, Maya, nowhere near the murder scene. Darnell is scared, quite rightly, and we see how the population is controlled by fear, as he's not even sure that he even has a job. He might have lost his job just by trying to do the right thing. Darnell tells Bryan he's to say sorry to Johnny D, but he can't continue to tell the truth on Johnny D's behalf. So how's all that as far as reality goes, Martin?
Well, the threats received by Eva and Bryan were many and varied, and they did happen, but as it turns out, none of them were carried out. We don't know if any were attempted to be carried out. Bryan's investigation into the real events surrounding the murder of Rhonda Morrison turned up lots of information that had not emerged at the original trial. The Stonewall silence encountered by Bryan and Eva was something prevalent throughout certain states and areas, and to a degree can still exist, stemming from intimidation, some open and some more covert. The white population would be left in no doubt that siding with groups like the EJI was tantamount to treason, and at the same time the black population would be directly or indirectly threatened with dismissal from their jobs or violence or that type of thing. But also there's quite a deep-seated suspicion amongst, the ethnic minority communities, and this is something prevalent throughout the world, that if you talk to the authorities, i.e. the police who are trying to investigate, you either have no faith that they'll do anything about it, or worse, actually you'll be targeted, or that person's got valuable information, need to take them out. So it's a really difficult situation to break out of, which is obviously what Bryan and his organisation were trying to do. Now, he's spoken about the importance of building trust, Bryan Stevenson this is, letting people know that they can talk to him and his colleagues without fear of being outed or their names becoming public. And whilst the EJI might try and persuade someone to give evidence to an investigation or a trial, he says he's absolutely adamant it's always up to that individual's conscience. The more people who resist the fear and stand up, the less the power of the perpetrators of that fear. Sadly, Darnell Houston did feel unable to give evidence due to the intimidation aimed at him, and as we're about to find out, he has been arrested and charged. He genuinely was initially charged with perjury on the basis that, he's changing his story. So he's either lying the first time or lying the second time. Either way, we're going to charge him with perjury. That's just, I can only imagine that's illegal first. When someone's saying, look, okay, yeah, I did tell a lie. I don't know, maybe it's not, but it's quite clearly intimidation.
But it did really happen, and it did really work. He did put his head in and say, this is too risky for me to help you, Johnny D. So, kudos to the filmmakers. It's a terrible story, as you say.
Yeah, and as Bryan mentions more than once in the movie and in his real account of the investigation, all he and Eva were really doing was what the original investigation should have done. And one thing that sometimes I feel is lost a bit in the movie is there genuinely was a lovely, innocent teenage girl, Rhonda Morrison, was horribly murdered. She did nothing to deserve that. And I think it's worth not losing sight of the fact that, you know, this is about a really horrible crime. And at the same time, of course, the pressure on the law enforcement, you've got to find someone. And I think, clearly for some, whatever reason, having an affair with a married white woman or not, Johnny D was identified. Yeah, he'll be our scapegoat.
Justice is secondary to a quick resolution.
Yeah.
Okay. So now that Houston's been intimidated not to help out, we see a furious Bryan storm off into the sheriff's office, and when he gets there, he finds the district attorney there at the same time. We see the sheriff and Bryan argue for a while, and then Tate, the district attorney, agrees to drop the charges against Darnell Houston.
Tate's the sheriff.
Oh, I beg your pardon, thank you. So the sheriff agrees to drop the charges against Darnell, but the district attorney reveals that the appeal for a retrial for Johnny D has been denied. Driving home in the dark, we see Bryan pulled over by a cop. The cop tells him to get out of the car, and when Bryan asks why, the cop pulls his gun and shouts at Bryan to get out of the car. He's held against the car with the cop's gun pressed to his head. He's called boy derogatorily, and then the two cops suddenly just leave, and they tell Bryan he should be grateful that something worse didn't happen. Bryan visits Johnny, and he learns that Johnny has been placed on death row when he was remanded in non-custody. So Bryan is shocked that Johnny would have been placed on death row straight away before he'd even been tried. So intimidatory tactics before his trial. Johnny just laughs and says, well, that's how it's done down here. Johnny also advises Bryan to train another lawyer, as Johnny will need a spare in case they take Bryan out. Bryan tells Johnny that he wants to try and talk to Ralph Myers, the key witness for the prosecution. Okay, so how do they go in that section?
In the scene, you can see the charges against Darnell were baseless, and probably the sheriff and the DA know that, and it's doubtful they ever intended to try and proceed against Darnell Houston. But they don't care now, because the retrial's been quashed, so they feel they've won. The incident with the cops, it did happen, kind of, but not in those circumstances shown. What it was Bryan had returned home late one evening, pulled up outside his house, but stayed in the car to hear the end of the song that was played on the radio, because it was a particular favourite of his. A neighbour, seeing, I assume, a black man sitting in a car, called the police, worrying it might be a burglar. Someone sat in a car on the street late at night might arouse suspicions. So when the cops arrived, it wasn't that Bryan wouldn't get out of the car. He went to get out of the car sort of straight away to explain, oh, no, it's okay, I live here. And one of the cops unholstered his gun. Nothing came of it, but Bryan did speak of the implicit threat that hung over anyone, particularly of colour, when dealing with the police at this time in Alabama. And bear in mind, this is the 1990s. This is not the 1960s.
We've had terrible business in current times where, you know, they say driving while black. You know, you can get into all sorts of mischief just by minding your own business. But anyway, we won't go down that particular detour. Okay, so back to the movie. We get to meet the key prosecution witness, Myers, and he's a disfigured white man who's also in prison and demands a soda of Bryan before he agrees to talk. Bryan remains calm and polite. He thanks Myers for meeting with him. He asks about his testimony that put Johnny D away, but Myers says he's refusing to talk about that, although he's happy to talk about anything else. Bryan cleverly steers the conversation back towards Johnny and his case. Myers reveals from the day he was arrested, the cops were demanding that Myers tell them whatever he knows about the murder of Rhonda Morrison and who he thinks might have committed it. Bryan then visits the county records, the archives where the librarian allows him to make copies of Myers' testimony, including some audio tapes of Myers. He listens to the tapes, and Myers is heard saying that he knows nothing about the murder of Rhonda Morrison, and he's not willing to frame an innocent man with the murder. Okay, so we've got the key figure of Myers. He's played by the great character actor Tim Blake Nelson. How did they go portraying him in the flesh for the first time?
Yeah, it's spookily well. Yeah, really well. he has these disfiguring scars from a childhood fire injury. The real Ralph Myers, he'd had a pretty horrible life, physically abused as a child. He was a petty criminal, and I can't remember what his convicted crime was, but it was pretty violent, and I think he was serving a pretty lengthy sentence. And this was basically, he'd been approached by Sheriff Tate and other cops and pressured into making an entirely false statement about the events surrounding the murder of Rhonda Morrison in their efforts to convict Johnny D. The audio tape really did exist, and its discovery is one of the mainstays of Bryan's argument for Johnny D getting a retrial. So I don't want to get too far ahead, because that's about to be covered, I think. There is actually, as we'll see, there is a moral compass.
Let's get back to the movie. We're back in the prison, and Johnny is comforting Herbert now that it's the eve of Herbert's execution. Johnny reminds him that reprieves often arrive at the last minute, and Bryan is working to get one for Herbert as best he can. We see Bryan working hard, looking for precedents and legal arguments to try and have Herbert's execution commuted or at least held for a bit. Eva and Bryan work through the night, and the next morning they're both in their office when the phone rings, and Bryan is told that his efforts to stay the execution of Herbert have been denied. Bryan tells Eva that he will have to go and witness the execution. Then we see the guards allow Herbert to say goodbye to his friends, fellow inmates. We see his head get shaved before Bryan arrives, and Bryan is allowed a few minutes with Herbert in his holding cell. Herbert is calm, and he expresses gratitude to Bryan for his efforts so far. We see Herbert strapped into the electric chair, and a public address system plays Ella Fitzgerald singing The Old Rugged Cross. Johnny D and the other prisoners use their tin cups to beat a slow rhythm against their cell doors. We see Bryan sat with several other observers in an adjacent room as the prisoners' noise and cacophony of tin cups reaches them. And then the switch is thrown, and although we don't see it, Bryan's expression tells us that Herbert has been executed. Then we're back in Eva's car, and we see Bryan quietly sobbing. Now, what about the demise of Herbert Richardson? How was that scene? Accurate?
I don't know how accurately they portrayed the exact words said by different people, but yeah, this is very spot on. Bryan did fail to get Herbert Richardson a stay of execution. Realising that, he did drive to the prison to be with Herbert in his final hours, as he promised. He also attended the execution, and this cemented his determination that it's not an appropriate form of punishment. They really did play That Old Rugged Cross, Ella Fitzgerald's singing it, which is very powerful. And the cups being... Sorry, excuse me, I just got to move a cat. The cups being banged had become a tradition amongst the death row inmates when an execution was taking place, as a part protest, part solidarity with their fellow inmate who was going to the chair. Not pleasant. But for anyone who's slightly squeamish, you don't see the execution. You see Bryan watching it.
More determined than ever to see Johnny D's case retried, we see Bryan poring through old case documents and evidence files. He returns to speak to Ralph Myers and confronts Ralph over the recording Bryan had heard, where Myers originally denied knowing anything about Johnny D's involvement in the murder. Bryan has found a prison log which shows that Sheriff Tate had transferred Johnny D and Ralph Myers together to the state prison. Bryan suggested the sheriff put the two of them on death row to put pressure on Myers to testify against Johnny D. Myers reveals that he was in fact there when an electric chair execution took place. He called the sheriff the very next day and said he'd sign whatever he needed to avoid the same fate. Bryan tells him he'd like Myers to take the stand at Johnny D's retrial and tell the court what had happened. Myers initially refuses, but Bryan leaves him with food for thought, telling him if he wants to make things right with Johnny D, this will be his last opportunity. So is any of that true about Ralph Myers being intimidated in that fashion?
It is. The only bit it's unclear is whether he was actually made to attend an execution, which I think I think is unlikely, or he was just incarcerated at the state prison when one took place. I mean, either way, it was a powerful lever in his original decision to agree to incriminate Johnny D. And it is absolutely true, which I think we skipped over earlier when you mentioned in the synopsis, that Johnny D was arrested, remanded in custody, and held on death row for a year, I think it was, before his trial took place. So he's a remanded prisoner. He's innocent till proven guilty is a principle that is meant to exist in America, the same as most other countries. But no, he was actually put on death row before he was convicted, which is incredible. Yeah.
Okay, so back to the movie. We see a news reporter setting up, saying how emotional this retrial of Johnny D is likely to be, as the murdered young white girl, Rhonda Morrison's parents, are convinced that Walter McMillian, aka Johnny D, is guilty and killed their daughter. The judge opens the retrial by saying that anyone who feels they'll be unable to maintain a calm level of decorum should leave now, and of course no one does. Bryan opens the case by dismantling the state's case, saying that they have no physical evidence and no witnesses bar one man. He then calls that one witness, Ralph Myers, to the stand. Myers takes the oath and starts to answer Bryan Stevenson's question, but appears unsure and evasive. Bryan presses him and gets to the stage where he asks Myers if the testimony he gave at the original trial was true, but Myers is evasive and says he doesn't remember. Bryan then realises that Myers has been got to and positions himself so Myers can't make direct eye contact with Sheriff Tate or the District Attorney. Bryan makes Myers identify Johnny D in the courtroom, and in doing so has to make eye contact with Johnny D. Asked again if his testimony was true in the original trial, this time Myers admits that he made it all up. The District Attorney then takes his turn and tries to imply that Myers has changed his story now to try and get out of prison early. Myers makes the very good point that neither he nor Johnny D decide what happens to them. It's like the sheriff and the DA, it's those like the sheriff and the DA that decide, and if anything, come clean about the murder of Rhonda Morrison is likely to make his position worse. Bryan brings forward a succession of witnesses who had never been brought up in the original trial, many of whom confirm that pressure was applied to give a version of events that supported the DA's case against Johnny. The judge says that he'll consider the case and decide on whether a retrial can be granted. Outside, Johnny D thanks Bryan and is then given a few minutes to speak with his family. So, how did all that go? How did Myers go on the stand the second time? Was it as portrayed and the other details correct?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I suppose we should explain is we'd heard earlier when Bryan went to confront Sheriff Tate about this ridiculous perjury charge against Darnell Houston, that they informed Bryan, the DA and the sheriff, that the appeal for a retrial had been denied. Now we find ourselves at a hearing to decide again if there should be a retrial, and that was done through repeated appeals by Bryan and Eva and the EJI. So, as we mentioned earlier, we should always remember the fact that Rhonda Morrison's parents, they found a degree of closure with the conviction of Johnny D. They may not have been aware, or they may, I don't know, of the holes in the investigation, but you can understand their reluctance to go through this all again, and their anger that, well, if it wasn't him, who was it? So I think that's understandable, at least at first. I've not been able to find if Bryan Stevenson genuinely used his body position to block Ralph Myers' view of the DA and the sheriff, because the movie makes it a very subtle but a very key point and very effective. But he did ask Myers to identify Johnny D. Sorry about the noise. Colin, can you go and play in the garden, mate? Please? Oh, dear. I might have to go and throw him outside and shut the door in a minute. Bless you. So, yeah, he did ask Myers to identify Johnny D. It made him meet his eye, and in doing so, saw a fellow inmate for who he was. It wasn't just a name. And the point that Bryan makes has us convinced that the judge has no option but to order retrial. I mean, it's so clearly been a miscarriage. Or if not a miscarriage, not all the evidence has been presented. So, and bearing in mind, the original trial lasted a day and a half. In one account I read, it suggested that the jury deliberated for an hour and a half, and then you read another dozen that say, no, the whole trial, day and a half, jury probably took about 20 minutes. Yeah, guilty. Yeah, I know.
Amazing. All right, well, back to the movie. It's 1 month later, and we see the judge addressing the assembled court again. We learn that the judge has decided that there is not sufficient evidence that Ralph Myers lied in his first court appearance, and so therefore no new trial will be convened. There's shock and disbelief among Johnny Depp's family and supporters, too much for his son, who rises in the court and protests to the judge, but his son is eventually dragged out by deputies. Bryan manages to calm things down, but leaving the court sees the devastation on the faces of Johnny's family as they tearfully climb into their cars. Back at the prison, the guards try to get Johnny back into his cell, and he too resists, ending up being forced in and handcuffed. We see Bryan and Eva sat by the river, with Bryan pondering the optimism with which he'd arrived and promised Johnny Depp's family they'd get a retrial. He's despondent about his chances of persuading a primarily white legal system that they've wrongfully convicted an innocent black man. Eva tells him to basically buck up and keep fighting, that she once heard it said that a lawyer should never get emotionally close to their clients, but she thinks this is crap, as she's seen Bryan gain motivation from his closeness with the clients. So how was that about the judge denying a retrial and all that? Is that fairly accurate?
No, it can't be. It's so ridiculous and patently biased that you couldn't possibly believe that happened in real life, but yeah, it did.
But of course it did.
Yeah, in reality, in the movie it's a Judge Foster, but the real judge was a Judge Thomas B. Norton, who decided against a retrial. And this is where he made the comment that I don't see any compelling evidence that Ralph Myers lied before and is now telling the truth, when he could just as easily been telling the truth before and is now lying. And he's basically using the argument that Ralph Myers is an unreliable witness as the reason to not retry, when the entire conviction is based on this unreliable witness's evidence. I mean, yeah, you couldn't make it up, could you?
No, well, it is Hollywood. Let's hope that as we're coming to the end that we have a happier ending than we've had to date. So back in the movie, we see Bryan with Johnny apologising for their setback. Johnny is philosophical about what's happened, but he also encourages Bryan to continue on. But he says, Bryan, you've got nothing to be sorry for. We see Bryan back with the family, Johnny Depp's family, telling that he will appeal to the Alabama Supreme Court in Montgomery. They can overturn this circuit court decision. He says he also has another move he plans to make to help get the truth out. The something he has in mind is a 60 minutes documentary, which we see being watched by Johnny's family. We see Johnny being interviewed, Ralph Myers and the DA too, and the program is also being watched by Sheriff Tate in a bar, and of course Johnny's family at home. We then see a news report that the Alabama Supreme Court has overturned that retrial decision. Interviewed by the reporter, Bryan tells her that not only will they have a retrial for Walter McMillian, they hope to see him released immediately as well. In his office, Bryan has a visitor who serves him with a plea. It's Tom Chapman, the DA, and he's asked for a stay of the retrial to allow him to initiate a new investigation. Bryan realises that the DA is trying to buy time to rebuild the DA's case. Bryan then goes to the same man, Tom Chapman, and confronts him at his home, telling him it's wrong for him to keep an innocent man on death row just to protect Chapman's reputation. Chapman angrily denies that it's about his reputation. He says it's about the people who elected him to protect them, which seems to be one and the same thing. Bryan asks him which people he's referring to. He tells Chapman that he believes Chapman knows the difference between right and wrong. He's filing a petition to dismiss all charges against Johnny D, and he asks Chapman to join him in that. Chapman simply tells him to get off his property. So he's trying to get Chapman to come on his side and literally stop arguing against Johnny D and acknowledge the truth that he's innocent. Is that at all accurate? I guess it is, if everything else of the film has got anything to go by.
Yeah, there were 4 attempts to overturn Johnny D's conviction, and the final one was passed by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, which I think is what they refer to in the movie as the Alabama Supreme Court, which all judges unanimously agreeing a new trial should be brought. What's not clear is why the 3 earlier attempts had failed and the 4th one succeeded. And it is possible that the 60-minute documentary, which, think about the Insider, the tobacco industry movie we covered. Yeah, that was very 60-minute orientated. But the 60-minute documentary really did happen. You can find it on YouTube, both excerpts and the entire programme. How influential that was is not clear, but it almost certainly did make a difference. And as mentioned earlier, the real-life antagonism between Tom Chapman, the district attorney, and Bryan Stevenson, if anything, is underplayed by the movie. However, once faced with what can only be described as irrefutable evidence of Johnny D's innocence, even Chapman, or at least the strong possibility, even Chapman, who was a lawyer after all, he was forced to concede. And yeah, so we've got this retrial now coming up.
Okay. So back in the movie, we arrive at court for the public hearing, and Bryan finds Johnny's family and supporters being kept outside the room by a legal deputy. They're finally allowed in, and the female judge calls them to order and invites Bryan to open proceedings. Bryan's opens with a speech about this is the rule of law. Have we got a clip of that one, Martin?
We certainly have, and it's very, very good.
It's easy to see this case as one man trying to prove his innocence. But when you take a black man and you put him on death row a year before his trial and exclude black people from serving on his jury, when you base your conviction on the coerced testimony of a white felon and ignore the testimony of 24 law-abiding black witnesses, when any evidence proving his innocence is suppressed and anyone who tries to tell the truth is threatened, this case becomes more than the trial of just a single defendant. It becomes a test of whether we're going to be governed by fear and by anger or by the rule of law. If the people standing in the back of this courtroom are all presumed guilty when accused, if they have to leave here and live in fear of when this very thing will happen to them, if we're just going to accept a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, then we can't claim to be just. If we say we're committed to equal justice under law, to protecting the rights of every citizen, regardless of wealth, race, or status, then we have to end this nightmare for Walter McMillian and his family. The charges against them have been proven to be a false construction of desperate people, fueled by bigotry and bias, who ignored the truth in exchange for easy solutions, and that's not the law. That's not justice. That's not right. I ask that this case be dismissed immediately, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay. So, Bryan requests that this case be dismissed. The judge calls the district attorney to open the state's case. The DA, Chapman, asks to approach the judge and tells her that he's worried if the people in the courtroom expect to be kept safe, and that if someone commits a crime, they expect that person to be caught and punished. Hesitating, the DA then adds that in this case he's reviewed the evidence and will not object to Bryan's position. The judge asks him to confirm that the DA is joining the motion to dismiss, and much to the horror of Sheriff Tate, who's sitting next to him, DA Chapman says that's exactly what he's doing. So, Johnny D is a free man. He's overwhelmed with emotion, as are most of his family. The sheriff storms out and the DA sits at his desk looking shell-shocked. We see Johnny pack his things from his cell and walk out, his fellow prisoners giving him a chorus of tin mug rattling and clattering. Johnny shakes hands through the cell doors as he makes his way to freedom. Bryan then gives us a voiceover as we see him drive Johnny to his house at a homecoming party. Then he's at a meeting accompanied by Johnny D where he tells the assembled people that we all need justice, we all need mercy, and maybe a degree of unmerited grace. The end titles, as Martin suggested, show us images of the real characters. Bryan, we read's been fighting for the wrongly condemned for over 30 years. The Equal Justice Initiative have won retrials, reprieves or reversals for over 140 prisoners on death row. Eva Ainsley has continued as operation manager for the EJI. Herbert Richardson was one of over 65 people executed in Alabama since 1983 for whom no adequate legal assistance was provided. Walter McMillian, aka Johnny D, remained close friends with Bryan until his death in 2013 from early onset dementia. Anthony Ray Hinton, the other inmate close to Johnny and Herbert, was convicted of a double homicide in 1986 based almost entirely on a faulty ballistics report. The prosecutor said he could tell Ray was guilty just by looking at him. Bryan and the Equal Justice Initiative took Ray's case to the Supreme Court, and in 2015, after nearly 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, Ray was set free. We then get to see the real Ray being released, accompanied by a smiling Bryan Stevenson. Ralph Myers was released in 2017 after spending 30 years in prison. Tom Tate remained Sheriff of Monroe County until his retirement in 2019, being re-elected 6 times after the release of Johnny D. We learned that District Attorney Tom Chapman remained DA until he retired in 2012. In 1993, a new investigation into the murder of Rhonda Morrison confirmed Johnny D's innocence and strongly implicated a white man suspected of a murder. However, no charges were ever filed. The final captions tell us that for every 9 people executed in the US, 1 person on death row has been proven innocent and released. As the caption states, this is a shocking rate of error. Movie ends.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to help us wrap up all of that, Martin?
Yeah, I mean, the speech that Bryan Stevenson gives, and it's almost, as far as I can tell, word for word, exactly what he said. I mean, it shines a light directly on the underlying problems of the Alabama justice system as it was then. We can hope things have improved, but anyone who's kept up with current events in the last few years knows there's a long way to go yet. As much as the attempted framing of Johnny D, which was carried out with as much malice as it lacked competence, the problems are identified as the ignoring of dozens of law-abiding citizens that Johnny D couldn't have committed the murder of Rhonda Morrison, yet accepting the word of a single convicted white criminal who was offered a more lenient sentence in return for what proved to be false testimony. The movie shows Chapman, the DA, as being about to fight against the dismissal of charges, then almost give up. I mean, in truth, Tom Chapman said since he arrived at court knowing he would not protest against the dropping of all charges. He was a lawyer and he knew a lost cause when he saw one. But as we learned from the end titles, both he and the sheriff would go on to win several more elections after that, which is, I don't know, in Tom Chapman's case, maybe that's quite understandable. Sheriff Tate, less so. Reading several legal articles about Alabama, it becomes clear, and this has been said by generally retiring Alabama judges, anyone standing as a judge who declaims the death penalty will not be elected. Anyone who claims to be in favour and then fails to apply the death penalty will be challenged and then beaten when their re-election comes up. So to go back to Judge Robert E. Lee Key, who overturned the original trial verdict, the jury's sentence for Walter McMillian from life imprisonment, he changed it to death. There was the moving of the trial to a different county where there was a much higher white population percentage. The prosecutors withheld exculpatory evidence. The state's principal witness avoided a capital murder charge by testifying against McMillian. Other witnesses were paid thousands of dollars for their false testimony. The state's 3 primary witnesses all later recanted, and the state of Alabama eventually admitted it had all been a terrible mistake. Despite all of this, it's worth remembering that if Key had not demanded a death penalty, Walter McMillian would probably still be wasting away in prison, along with scores of other convicted murderers who, precisely because they're not facing execution, generate neither public interest nor the attention of the country's top capital defenders, like Bryan Stevenson, who employ an emergency room triage system, understandably, that focuses on those in the greatest need. So actually, Robert E. Lee Key may have done Johnny D something of a favour, once you get past the fact that any judge with any legal integrity should have thrown the case out before it ever saw the light of day in a courtroom. But just to finish off, is interesting here, we've got a clip from the real Michael B. Jordan was on the Ellen show. That's Ellen DeGeneres, I think, isn't it?
Generous, yeah.
DeGeneres, yeah. And she proved to be very generous, actually, because her and her show staff made a massive donation to the EJI after this interview. So they're interviewing Michael B. Jordan, who is then joined by the real Bryan Stevenson. So she's got some stats that are worth hearing, and then Bryan just says his piece, which is equally worth hearing. So we've just got that clip.
In the 70s, there were 300,000 people in jail. Now there are 2.2 million in jail. 1 in 3 black babies will end up in jail. Black defendants are 11 times more likely to get the death penalty than white ones. It's infuriating.
It is, and that's what drew me into this work. I feel like we're in a crisis. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, 6 million people on probation parole. There's 70 million Americans that have criminal arrests, which means that they're often disfavored when they try to get jobs or try to get loans. 132 million people in this country have family members in our jails and prisons, and it would be one thing if it was necessary, but we put people in jails and prisons for silly things. I'm representing people who are serving life sentences for writing a bad check of $50 or simple possession of marijuana, life without parole. So we have this over-incarceration and this excessive punishment problem. And that's what drew me into this work, and it's one of the reasons why I feel like it's so urgent that people learn and know more about what's happening.
Absolutely. You talk about people of color being presumed dangerous, and this story is crazy.
Yeah, it's happened to me. I went into a courtroom just a couple of years ago. I just argued a case at the U.S. Supreme Court, and I was there in this courtroom in the Midwest to do a hearing. And when I walked in, I had my suit and tie on. I was sitting at defense counsel's table, and the judge walked in, and when he saw me, he started screaming at me. He said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I had to explain to him, I said, no, Judge, I am the lawyer. My name is Bryan Stevenson. And he started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. Client came in, we did the hearing, but afterward I was thinking, what is it when this judge saw a middle-aged black man in a suit and tie? It didn't even occur to him that's a lawyer. And that kind of thinking is what's behind all of the frustration when police shoot unarmed black and brown people. It's behind the frustration that so many people have when their loved ones are carted off to prison for things they didn't do. And that's part of what we're trying to get at through this story.
Well, number one, that he even said that to you, but then he laughs afterwards instead of being embarrassed and saying, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And it's incredible.
Well, we haven't done in this country what other countries have done, which is to try to engage in a reckoning, in a truth and reconciliation process. In South Africa, outside of their constitutional court, there are emblems and emblem designed to make sure that no one forgets the injustice of apartheid. But in this country, we haven't talked about slavery. We haven't talked about the native genocide. We don't talk about lynching. We haven't created the kind of memorialization symbols that are designed to make sure we are truthful and honest about this history. You start talking about race and people get nervous. And that has to change, and that's why I'm hoping that we will have an era of truth and justice in this country. And we shouldn't fear it, because I just think there's something better waiting for us in America. I do.
So, what do we think about overall, the historical accuracy? I mean, obviously it was very high. Was it a 9 out of 10?
Easy, yes. Yeah. I'd say it was a 9, at least a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I agree. It was really accurate. The things I thought weren't proved to be pretty spot on, and it got not just the tone and the vibe, it got actually the details spot on. It was really accurate. It was very enjoyable to see. What about the entertainment?
Sorry, go on.
Did you enjoy it?
It's really watchable. This is what I think is the best thing about entertainment as a lever to open people's minds. Doesn't work when it's preachy, when it tells you that, you must be stupid or evil because you don't understand this, but we're telling you, you know, it's not like that at all. I remember getting turned off a bit, one of the comic relief things where you've got some, you know, millionaire comedian shouting at you, if you're watching this, you better have paid for it, you know, you people sat on your backsides overprivileged, and you're like, whoa, dude, chill. You know, it's like, don't start having a go at me. You need to persuade me. And this movie, I mean, it's so watchable. It's so entertaining.
It somehow got under the radar, though. I didn't know of it until you suggested it for the pod. And, you know, as you say, it got bugger all, you know, recognition in the awards for some reason. But it's a great film. It's very enjoyable, very entertaining. I mean, it's at least, I don't know, 8 out of 10 for entertainment, don't you think?
Oh, goodness, yeah. I'm probably, I'd say if we did halves, I'd be an 8.5.
So, look, watch
really
it if you haven't,
watchable.
guys. It's really accurate historically and very entertaining at the same time.
Yeah, and it's so subtly understated. It basically, it lays out the facts and leaves you to draw your own conclusion. And, you know, if you share cultural and political beliefs with Judge Robert E. Lee Key, you'll find yourself being very angry and shouting at the screen. But you probably aren't listening to us now because
very true.
You've probably been put off us long ago. Yes. So I think
it's been a long time between drinks, but it was a good one to get back in the groove on, I think. Can you remind me what plans we've got after this? I know we've still got a couple of reviews to get through too, but what do you hope to tackle next, Martin?
Well, the next movie on our list was The Two Popes, and I think we'll probably go there. I think it's fair to say we've had a very long layoff. There's a couple of supplementaries that we might put together and get out in the next few weeks, and I think it's fair to say that we are almost certainly not going to be in a position to return to our fortnightly output of before, so we're going to be a bit more patchy. But if the good folks out there have enjoyed this and continue to enjoy it, please just keep us on your podcatchers, and you know you'll know when we pop a next one up. We'll try and keep the website up to date with news and as it grows. So and we've had a number of suggestions, which we'll get to in a minute probably, of you know other bits and pieces, other movies that we might be covering in the near future. But I think The Two Popes was up next, which friends keep saying to me, you've got to watch it, it's really good, and I haven't actually watched it yet.
Well, Martin, if it's okay by you, our dinner guests have arrived. I might leave you to wrap it up with the news and reviews, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we will speak again soon.
Yeah, and thanks for all your work on this one, and I look forward to the next one.
Brilliant. All right, thanks, Andrew. Okay, folks, it's just me and Lee. So we've had a number of reviews since we last spoke. We got 5 stars from Neil Youngson in the UK, and he titled his review, Essential Listening for Film Buffs. If you love films, you'll love this podcast. Films based on historical events can be very interesting, but sometimes you're left wondering just how accurately the film represented real events. No longer in this always interesting and often fascinating podcast. Neil, thank you so much. That is really encouraging. We also had 5 stars from Kayaker63 in the US, and it's entitled Bravo Zed. I stumbled on this looking for a podcast to support Phil road time on a business trip. Listened to the Dam Busters and Break 'em a Rant, and I was hooked. I enjoyed the guest podcast historians of both episodes as I listened to both World War II and the Anglo-Boer War. Of course, Dam Busters, we had Ray Harris Jr. from the World War II podcast, and Break 'em a Rant, we were joined by our good friend Des Latham. I think Ray and Des are both on 3 guest episodes each. So they're in some kind of competition, and Des was the host of the Anglo-Boer War podcast, which was absolutely fascinating. Then, in the interest of balance, I'm going to read you the 2 stars we were given from the JPS in the UK. And he or she titled their review, Disappointing. I thought by the title this would have gravitas. but it is too opinionated in a superficial way. For example, its analysis of the Union Station sequence in The Untouchables boils down to too long. They mentioned Potemkin, but I expected more from a history podcast. So not really sure what the JPS's problem is. We don't want to have too much gravitas, that can just become boring. And opinions are what generate debate. So I'm afraid I'm going to continue to put mine out, but everyone's entitled to their own opinions, of course. And 2 stars, we had the 1 star from that chap way long back in the beginning who said we were far too politically correct for his taste, which is fine. But thankfully, there's enough of you lovely folks giving us 5 stars that it hasn't really affected our percentages. For example, we've got, it's either, have I typoed this? I might have typoed, I think this is probably Wayne Gardner in Canada. I assume that's not Wayne Gardner, the ex-motorcycle racer. But we've got 5 stars from, it could be Wayne Gardner, it could be Wanye Gardner, because I've put the N before the Y, but that's probably me. Always a great listen. This podcast provides an excellent combination of history and entertainment, with Andrew Martin providing thoughtful analysis of both with respect to the movies they review. The analysis is delivered with voices that are very easy on the ear and a sometimes irreverent sense of humour. This podcast has opened my eyes to history I was not aware of, and has also enhanced my history, or my understanding of history, of which I was already aware. I cannot recommend it highly enough. That is beautiful. Thank you very much, Ms. Gardner, Mr. or Mrs. Gardner, Wanye or Wayne. No, it's got to be Wayne Gardner, isn't it? In Canada. And we also had 5 stars from GPBXG from the United Kingdom. Love it. Cracking podcast. I know you're looking for more female-led films, so how about Carve Her Name with Pride, about the SOE operatives in World War II, starring Virginia McKenna. That is a name, a movie title I recognise, but I can't remember if I've seen it. But it's a great suggestion. I'm going to do some research, and it's definitely on the long list pending further information. In listener feedback, we heard from David in Augusta, Georgia, a regular correspondent who revealed himself to be the Seda fanatic who left a review which I read out in the last episode. Seda is an abbreviation of Crusader, the F-8 aircraft of which David is a big fan. So another mystery cleared up. We also heard from Hugh O'Donnell, an academic, and I think he's a secondary school teacher. He's in Scotland looking to developing board games to use as a vehicle to encourage learning about difficult subjects at secondary school level, although I'd imagine the use could be effectively extended to all ages, or all higher ages. Sounds fascinating, one I'll definitely be following, so Hugh, please do keep us in the loop. If there's anything we can do to assist, please do get in touch again. We also had an email from Brad Michaels, our retired FBI listener do you know what? I can't remember where Brad's from. I think it's Colorado. Anyway, Brad's is well. His wife has had COVID, was pretty sick for a while, but recovered fully. Brad himself never had a sniffle, and he lets us know that his oldest boy, Joe, is a newly minted New Orleans Police Department officer. So, as he says, very interesting time to be a cop in America. And he says if we ever need New Orleans info, then he's the man for us. So very much a huge congratulations to both Brad and Joe. And looking forward to hearing more. We've had some wonderfully generous financial support from Gary Shavit, and equally generous and welcome donations from Josh Tutel, Charles Kington, and a Christmas bonus from Dr. Phil Pomerantz. Thank you all. We also heard from Nick Parkinson, and Nick mentioned Greyhound, the Tom Hanks movie about a convoy escort crossing the Atlantic in World War II. Now, the movie is based on The Good Shepherd, a wonderful book by C.S. Forrester, he of Hornblower fame. Now, I recently watched it, and I must admit, I found it a bit meh. Yes, it's Tom Hanks, it's got a very strong cast, but it just felt a bit like watching a video game where far too much happened in far too short a space of time. It's not really one for us because it is based on a novel, so none of the characters are true. It's a sort of an accurate general depiction or it's supposed to be. I didn't think it was. If you read the book, there are long periods of nothing, and that it failed to convey that tension of knowing that the next thing that's likely to happen is going to be a bad thing. If you want to see, I think, a far better portrayal, watch The Cruel Sea, or read the book by Nicholas Montserrat. Now, we also heard from Mark Vinette. Mark is the host of the History of North America podcast, which covers Mexico, the US and Canada from pre-human to modern days. It's delivered in neat 10 to 15 minute episodes. Mark certainly has the depth of knowledge to make this a fascinating journey. And here's the man himself just to tell you very briefly about his show.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. The History of North America podcast series is an incredible historical adventure that chronicles the thrilling, action-packed tale of a continent. I invite you to come along for the ride.
In further listener mail, Robin Manny suggested Walk the Line and Ray, biopics of Johnny Cash and Ray Charles respectively. I've seen the former, it's definitely on the list. I haven't seen the latter, but that also is on the list, and it's one I need to watch. Kelly Jenkins wrote in with some very nice compliments and also a couple of corrections, which are always very welcome. She's just listened to Cleopatra, episode 14, and pointed out that the pyramids were 2,500 years old by the time Cleopatra came along, not 1,000 as we mistakenly suggested. And I'm not sure why we'd have said that. It's something we should have known. So they were older to Cleopatra than she is to us, which is one of those real wow moments. And also, as a classical language student, Kelly was able to correct us on the translation of Veni Vidi Vici. It's first person singular, so it should read as I came, I saw, I conquered, whereas we reported it as we came, we saw, we conquered. This makes sense, as no one ever accused Julius Caesar of being overly modest. So thank you so much, Kelly. And thanks to all of you for bearing with us over this barren period. We hope to be back with you much sooner next time with the movie The Two Popes. And we'll also repopulate the planned episodes page so we show more than just one show ahead, we hope. That will take a little bit of consultation between Andrew and myself. As I say, I do have a couple of supplementary ideas which we can pop out, but our output is likely to remain irregular and infrequent for the foreseeable future. We're both living, Andrew's recently started a new job. I'm still working, but at the moment I'm solo with 6 cats to keep me company. But my wife Sharon is back in the UK with our daughter, where she's sort of project managing some home improvements. And we're just really waiting to see how the world emerges from this fairly dark last year. So we do wish you all the best, and we hope you are all safe and well. And we'll speak to you very soon. Thanks, and bye-bye.